Hello everyone, my name is Kyle Hubert, and I'm going to be talking about threat intelligence, specifically how to focus fire on the bad guys coming for your network. We've got a lot of information, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right into it. A little bit about me. I'm a network analyst and blue team lead for the Air Force. I really love my job. Every day I either get to build something, break something, or learn something, so that's awesome. I also like to tinker around with IoT security and purple teaming, and I do need to give the standard boilerplate. This is all personal viewpoints. This isn't official policy for DoD, Air Force, US government. However, if you would like to see some more of my personal views, you can follow me on Twitter there. That's @GetHubert. That's also my GitLab. So all of the documents that I'm going to be walking through and showing you guys today are going to be on my GitLab. So all the stuff that we talk through here will be found there afterwards. And then finally, I'm always looking for feedback. So if you like this talk, let me know. If there's some improvements you think I could make, also let me know. At the end of the day, I want to make sure that I'm providing the best product to the community. So if there's something you think we could make better, let me know and I'll make that change. Okay, so what is threat intelligence? Well, the good news is it's actually pretty straightforward. Threat intelligence is essentially blockchain IOCs analyzed using dynamic artificial intelligence, leveraging big data lakes. So I mean, it's pretty straightforward. If you have any questions, let me know, but that's basically it. Yeah, no, that's obviously not threat intelligence. So that's just a bunch of buzzwords I slapped together and threw it up on a slide. But it is unfortunate that threat intelligence has kind of become a buzzword in the industry. And it's just something, whenever you say threat intelligence, people's eyes kind of glaze over and you realize they're not really listening anymore. So I wanted to sit down and figure out how can we make this buzzword something that we can use tactically for our defense teams. Another misconception that we're going to be looking into is you need to throw a lot of money at this problem, that you need to spend a bunch of money on a threat intelligence solution, whatever that looks like. Everything you're going to see here today is a whole lot of $0, so you can find it for free, with the exception of one book. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, Intelligence-Driven Incident Response. That's about $60 online. So for $60 and a few free resources, you can get started with a threat intelligence program. So what to expect? What you will learn from this talk, how to prioritize the specific techniques for your defense team to hunt for, and how to focus your defenders on specific adversaries. Basically, instead of telling them to go find bad, how to focus them on specific threats. You're not going to learn some magic bullet that will always find the bad guy. And you're also not going to see what adversary techniques you just don't have to look for. This isn't trying to say, oh, you only have to look for these techniques and not other techniques. This is simply a way to prioritize so you can see which ones do you want to look for first. So what actually is threat intelligence? So the working definition that I came up with after doing some reading and research is the application and analysis, and the analysis bit is key, of threat information in order to better inform defenders how adversaries will accomplish their goals. Now, of course, we have threat information in there, so that begs the question, okay, what exactly is threat information? And that's actually defined by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And they define it as any information that can help an organization identify, assess, monitor, and respond to cyber threats. So taking all this together, you have your information is your hard data, if you will. It's your IP addresses, your facts, your statistics, things that don't change. And your intelligence is using that information to inform your defenders of a specific threat. So that last bullet, that's probably the most important bit of this presentation. So if you don't take anything else away from this, make sure you take that away. You want to make sure that your information is becoming intelligence when it's analyzed and used to inform defenders of a specific threat. That's key. Cool. So looking at the pyramid of pain, what does this look like if we're comparing this to the things you would find when you're doing a defense or a hunt, doing a hunt team? So the bottom three layers are usually your threat information, especially taken individually. So if you just have an IP address, for example, and it's like, okay, this IP address is bad, we know it's bad, but that's it. That's just threat information. That's just a hard data point that you can say, okay, this is bad, look for it, but that's all we know. However, if you say, hey, this IP address is used by APT28 for data exfiltration, well, now it starts to mean a little more for your hunt team and your defense strategies, whatever that looks like. And then, of course, once you get to the upper three levels of the pyramid of pain, that's when you're getting more into your threat intelligence. So that's when you're looking at your TTPs, your tools, your artifacts. Now, I'm not saying that threat information is worthless. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's just you don't want to confuse information with intelligence. For example, if you have a threat actor that is using the same C2 domains over and over and over again, obviously knowing what those domains are is important. If they're using the same malware, knowing what those hashes are is important. I'm simply saying that that hash by itself or that domain by itself with no other context is not threat intelligence, it's threat information. So why would you want to use threat intelligence now that you know what it is? Well, first and foremost, you want to understand who your adversary is. You want to know who's coming for your data, who's coming for your network. If you know who's coming for your crown jewels, if you will, you can do a much better job defending against them. Secondly, it will prioritize your defender actions. So you can't just tell your defense teams to go find evil. That doesn't work. So you want to give them a more prioritized list to say, okay, look for these threat actors specifically, or even better, look for these specific techniques that those threat actors use. And that's what we're going to get into, how you can actually dig in and find what those techniques are, excuse me. And then finally, you're going to increase your hunt efficiency. And what I mean by that is you'll start seeing that these techniques are shared amongst multiple threat actors. So for example, let's say PowerShell is used by all the threat actors that are targeting your organization. What you can do is you can say, okay, we want to have one hunt that looks for PowerShell, and just like that, you came up with one hunt that looks for a technique used by all the threat actors targeting your organization, as opposed to doing multiple hunts for that same technique over and over and over and over again, because you just didn't know that it was a shared technique until you sit down and actually rack and stack all the stuff that the adversaries are doing. So what do you need? You know what this is. You know why you would want to use threat intelligence. What do you need to actually start a threat intelligence program? Well, first you want to know what your organization's critical assets are. And I don't just mean the source code or your crown jewels or whatever your secret sauce is. I mean, that's also true, but you don't want to discount other things such as trusted partnerships. We've seen plenty of exploits happen and plenty of campaigns where the sole purpose of pwning one organization was simply to use it as a stepping stone essentially to another organization because they had a trusted partnership. Maybe that's with another organization, maybe that's with a research university, maybe that's with a government agency. But don't discount your trusted partnerships if you have those in your organizations, because those also would be very critical assets to guard and to keep an eye on. Once you know what your critical assets are and what you want to be defending, now you want to know what your resources are. And there's a lot of resources out there. There's a bunch of great open source information. You have industry white papers. We'll get into some of the information that you have at your disposal here in a bit. But you just want to try and get as much information as possible, because you want to ingest all of these white papers, these reports, what's going on in the world, so you have as good an idea of what's going on as possible to inform your defenders. The third one's probably the toughest, understanding your limits. This is difficult because you want to take a very critical look at your defense team and see where your blind spots could potentially be. Maybe they're a smaller team, maybe they're a younger team, maybe your tools don't cover certain areas of your network and you know that. Maybe you have a massive network and a very small defense team. So you just can't have your team looking for every bad guy ever across your entire enterprise, because it just won't work. So you need to sit down and have a very critical look at where your limitations are so you can go into this knowing what you can and can't do, essentially. And then finally, you need someone who really likes reading. As I said before, there's a lot of resources out there. We're going to get into some of them now. It's beefy. We're talking like hundreds and hundreds of pages of reading. So you need someone who can get through that, boil it down to what's useful, and then make it into a product that they can give to whether it's your tactical team or your C-suite, and make it into something that is usable for that customer. And that's a very, very tough job. Okay, so real quick, we're doing a crash course on strategic intelligence. The reason I'm doing this is it's going to come into play when we do this scenario at the very end. But basically, when I say strategic intelligence, this is any kind of information that you can use to shape an organization's security policies, defense strategies, your priorities. This is the kind of stuff that you would hand to your C-suite, and then they would read through it, or they would read your product and say, okay, based on what you're telling me, we're going to focus on these threat actors or threat actors from this region of the world. So this can be very important because these resources will also tell you some very interesting insights into what your potential threat actors' goals and priorities are. Namely, these three right here. The one on the left is the annual report to Congress. Now that talks about the Chinese military modernization efforts. That's looking at all of the stuff that the Chinese are doing to try to bulk up their military. And then the middle and the right ones there are made by the National Security Innovations Group, which is essentially a big think tank. And they do some really, really good strategic multi-layer assessments. That's what those are, the SMA papers. And those are very, very deep dives into the strategic goals for particular countries, their leadership, how the leadership thinks, different historical factors. They look into economics, political. They pull all sorts of information when they write these analyses. And they're very, very good, but they're very, very long. These three papers combined is about 500 pages of reading. So it's a little beefy, but if you can have someone to read through those and boil it down to something that's usable, it's very, very useful to start seeing who you might want to focus on from a strategic level. And it can also inform your boss's 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 boss who you might want to focus on in the future and what they're doing and what they might be interested in if your organization has some secret sauce that might be interesting to another country. So before we go any further, just so we're on the same page, when I'm saying tactic and technique, tactic would be your initial access or your persistence. Your technique is how you actually implement that tactic. So for example, if I say technique, the technique would be spear phishing link to accomplish the tactic of initial access. We're going to get into that in a bit, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page when I start throwing those words around. Okay, so how do you actually use threat intelligence? Well, basically, the way we broke it down was using this chart, and we started with all the bad guys ever. I think MITRE has 96 threat groups and like 416 different software sets. It's a stupid high number of things. So your defense team can't look for everything. It's just not going to happen. So the first step is to see who wants your stuff. So that's the orange layer there. And this is where some of your strategic information can come into play. So maybe you're reading through the documentation and maybe you see, I don't know, some alleged Chinese threat group might want something from your organization or something you're working on. So maybe you want to focus on the Chinese threat actors. Or maybe there's some industry white paper saying that there's recently been a campaign against, I don't know, universities. And you work in a university or some form of higher education. You might want to take that into consideration. So the first thing is, who wants your stuff? We'll say that you take all the information, you figure that out. Now you want to see who can access your stuff. Now this is a little bit more tricky. Generally, your who wants your stuff and who can get your stuff will be very, very similar, especially if you're talking about nation-state actors. What will help out here is if you've already had incidents in the past, if you have some internal reporting, and then that'll give you a better idea of who can actually get to your crown jewels, if you will. This also helps eliminate groups like hacktivists or cybercrime, things like that that you have already taken steps to try to mitigate as best as possible. And then finally, where the green is, what you want to try and do is see what the techniques are. So now you should have, ideally, a list of who wants your stuff and who can get your stuff. So what techniques do those groups share? What techniques are common across all the groups that you've identified and all the software sets that they use? And once you start identifying where those techniques overlap, that's really when you're going to start finding some good information to give your hunt team to say, okay, look for this particular technique. Look for this particular threat actor's way of doing business. So now we're going to jump into the scenario. Basically, we're going to pretend that we are an admin for the Defense Research University, and we're going to say that this university is an graduate university conducting research with various national labs and government agencies. So as an admin, the first thing you probably want to do is sit down and say, okay, well, who's targeted universities in the past? And there's a couple different resources out there. You have your FireEye threat intelligence reports by industry. Now, your mileage may vary on these, but it's a good place to start. These were put out originally in 2016. I haven't seen them get updated yet, but they are out there and they're a good resource. You can also use your M-Trends yearly report, which is great. That comes out obviously every year. Gives you a pretty good idea of what they're looking at potentially could happen in the coming year. And then, of course, your MITRE attack matrix groups. And this is just 3 examples. There's plenty out there. As I've said, there's plenty of white papers you can dig into. But for this example, I essentially went through the MITRE attack groups page and just Controlled F for research, university, center of academic excellence, things like that. So whenever we look at all this intelligence, what does it tell us? When we're actually boiling it down, what do we find when we're looking at people attacking universities? Well, we start with 96 threat actors. That's what I said. MITRE has 96 in the grand total of every bad guy ever. If you look at who's targeted specific education or higher education in the past, that boils down to about 9 threat actors. So right off the bat, even just doing step 1, you essentially knocked it down to 10%-ish of your original list, which is awesome. That's great. Then let's say that based on the strategic intelligence you gave your C-suite, they tell you they want to focus on specific alleged Chinese actors. So if you look at that group of 9, the alleged Chinese actors would then come down to 3. So of that 9, the ones that you would then be looking at are Deep Panda, APT-19, and Leviathan. So those are the 3, that's the 3 threat actors we're actually looking at for this scenario. And that's just step 1 of going through who wants your stuff, essentially, and then getting a little bit of an inject from your C-suite to help you out. So at this point, we've identified our targets. Now what do we want to do? We're going to make some hunt hypotheses. And ideally, you would make one of these for every threat actor. So in this case, we would have 3. And however, for time's sake, I'm only going to walk through 1. The idea behind these hypotheses is to make a narrative, essentially go through and say, how would the adversary accomplish their goal on your network? This is also very helpful for new analysts. It gives them a place to start, and it kind of walks them through, okay, this is kind of what we want to be looking for and what kind of progression we want to see if there is an adversary on the network. This is how we think they would go about doing it. And you basically build these hypotheses, again, reading through all of the white papers, seeing what adversaries like to do, how they like to do it. And they generally will come up with something that looks like this. Now, this is not something that I would say is set in stone. This is kind of what I just built as an example, so you can tweak this as you need. But in general, you're saying something along the lines of, we think some threat actor will initially compromise a target or targets on our network using some sort of technique. That's your initial access. From there, they're going to strengthen their position by another technique, so your persistence or your foothold, whatever you want to call it. Once they gain their persistence, then we expect the threat actor will pivot to another target using another technique. And then finally, they will complete their actions on the target or targets by a technique to accomplish their mission. Now, for this scenario, we're going to go ahead and say that the DRU is also working on some maritime R&D, so some maybe underwater UAVs or things like that. Sure, why not? Just so happens that Leviathan is very, very interested in maritime R&D. So this hypothesis, we're going to focus on Leviathan. If you look at some of the white papers, they generally like targeting external-facing web servers using web shells. So we're going to say that that's their initial access. That seems to be how they generally like to get on the network initially. They don't usually do phishing. They're one of the few groups that actually don't rely on phishing in some way, shape, or form for initial access. So we'll say that Leviathan is going to try to compromise our external-facing web servers using a web shell of some form or fashion. Then they're going to strengthen their position by gathering valid credentials, by cred dumping. And then once they have those credentials, we think Leviathan is going to pivot to our maritime R&D systems using RDP, because that is something, if you look in the white papers, they really, really like using RDP and SSH. So we're just going to pick RDP for argument's sake here. Finally, they're going to exfiltrate the R&D data by compressing and encrypting it to accomplish their mission. So that's basically what one of the hypotheses would look like if you were to write this out. And again, you would make these for every threat actor that you were looking for. You can also have multiple hypotheses per threat actor. You're not limited to just one per. This is just something to, again, once you go through all of your prioritized TTPs and your team saying, okay, well, now what? This is the now what. This is what you do next. Okay, so this spreadsheet here, this is what my team built out. Basically, we have a Python script. Again, this is going to be on the GitLab. The Python script pulls all of the data from the MITRE attack matrix and puts it into a CSV file. I will say that it doesn't have all the pretty formatting. I made that just to help with the readability, so you might have to do that on your own. But essentially what you have here is you're going to have your technique and your technique ID. And then the next column there is the total. So I know it's a little hard to read, but that very first one is resource hijacking. And the total there is 2. So that tells you that there's, of the 96 threat actors, 2 threat actors use resource hijacking. Of course, there you have all of your threat actors, and that's, of course, not all of them. I had to cut it for readability. But if there's a red box there, that means that they use the technique in some way, shape, or form. And then I also added a column or a row up top for the total TTP. So for example, the first one there is APT41. Ironically, they have 41 techniques that they use. For if you go through the line, you have soft cell, which has 28, and so on and so forth. So this is what the master list looks like, at least for the groups mapped to the MITRE attack techniques. What you're going to do is once you have this Excel spreadsheet, you can go through and just zero out all the columns for the threat actors you don't care about. So in this scenario, we're only focused on APT19, Deep Panda, and Leviathan. So I already went through and zeroed out all the columns for all the threat actors that were not those 3. We end up getting this chart here. So of our 3 threat actors that we're looking at, all 3 of them use scripting, PowerShell, and regserve32 in some way, shape, or form. So right off the bat, we can see that we have 3 techniques, that we want to focus on for our hunt team, because these are shared across all of our threat actors. So now you want to start thinking, okay, how am I going to start hunting these? What am I going to do on my tool set to start looking for scripting or PowerShell or regserve32? What does that look like? But this isn't the only thing you can do, because keep in mind we also have the software sets. So you have 416 some odd software sets. If you look at these 3 groups and then look at the software sets they use, you're looking at 18 unique software sets shared between these 3 actors. So we also have a Python to generate a software map to attack techniques. And again, I just focused on the top 3 here. Of the 18 software sets that these 3 actors use, 11 of them have command line interface in some way, shape, or form, 7 have remote file copy, and 7 of the software sets use process discovery. So right off the bat, now you have, well, I shouldn't say right off the bat, but at this point, you have 6 techniques that you can focus on to say, okay, these are the ones we really want to dig into because they're shared across all the groups and at least a majority of the software sets, which is awesome. And then this one is data sources. So what we're doing here is we're looking at and saying, okay, I basically filtered for just the 6 techniques that we already identified. And this chart tells us, again, pulling data from MITRE, what data sources we need to capture and what we need to ingest in order to identify and find these techniques. So as you can see, let's just use command line interface as an example. According to MITRE, there's only 2, from the totals column there, there's only 2 data sources you can use to find command line interface use, which, as luck would have it, are right there. You have process command line parameters and process monitoring. So if you have no way of capturing process command line parameters or process monitoring, you're kind of screwed. Like, you're not going to be able to find the command line parameters. Like, just according to MITRE, that's what the data is saying. So this is helpful to make sure that you are capturing all the data that you need in order to find these techniques after you identify them. Also an interesting tidbit, if you'll notice, Windows event logs won't help you on any of these techniques. If you think that just capturing Windows event logs is the end-all, be-all, and then you're good to go, hate to break it to you, but at least in this case, that's not going to happen. So you need to make sure you're capturing all the data sources required in order to actually find the techniques you're looking for. Okay, so now that we've stepped through the scenario, what did we accomplish? Well, we started with your 96 threat actors and your 416 software sets. That's a lot. That's a lot of things to go through and to tell your hunt team, dig through all of these and go find evil. However, we were able to dig down to our 3 most likely attackers, again, looking at the white papers and getting some intel injects from our C-suite to say what do we want to focus on. Of those 3, we built out a hunt hypothesis to vector our team. And then we also found the 6 specific TTPs for the hunt team to dig into. So the first thing they would do is look for those techniques, excuse me. And once they are done hunting for those 6 techniques, then you can say, okay, here's the hypotheses, here's what we think Leviathan's going to do, here's what we think APT19 is going to do, and then you can start having them run those down as well. And what that'll do is, at the end of all this, you should be able to say with a relatively high degree of confidence, okay, we don't think that these threat actors are in our network for these reasons, because we went through all of these techniques that we know that they use. So that's it. I know that's a lot of information. I know that's a weird way of looking at it, so if you guys have any questions, let me know. Again, all of this is going to be on my GitLab. So you can look at apt-get Hubert. That's all going to be up there. Thank you.